As a psychiatrist, I have specialised in the field of what we call intellectual disability. And many years ago, I was asked to see someone with Down syndrome who was in his 50s and who had developed quite serious problems and had been losing skills. And for the first time, I realised that people with Down syndrome were at risk for developing dementia. This man had dementia and needed a lot of extra support because of that. I then went and looked at the literature and found that this had been reported in the past, and we then developed a research program to help us better understand why this was the case, and ultimately to try and develop new treatments, and that's our long-term aim. So really it was meeting this person that led me to see people with Down syndrome, and particularly to see people with Down syndrome who were in their 30s, 40s and 50s and moving into the age when they were at risk for dementia. I think with all research in what is a very complex field, because you're talking about the brain, dementia is a disorder of the brain, and it's only become possible really in the last few years to fully research this topic, because there are now techniques for investigating the brain in life in ways that just wasn't possible 5 or 10 years ago. So one of the things that we do as part of our research is to use brain imaging, brain scanning, to look at how the brain changes as someone with Down syndrome gets older. But there was a very significant advance in the field in 1986 when experts in genetics recognized that a particular gene on chromosome 21, so it's chromosome 21 that people with Down syndrome have an extra copy of, but there was a particular gene called the amyloid gene, or the amyloid precursor protein gene on 21. And amyloid is something that is found deposited in the brain when people get Alzheimer's disease. So suddenly people realized that maybe people with Down syndrome were particularly at risk for Alzheimer's disease, which is the form of dementia they get, because they had too much of this amyloid, and over many, many years it got deposited in the brain and gave rise to Alzheimer's disease. So we've been investigating whether this is the case or not, in the hope that as medications are developed that can modify amyloid in the brain, it will be possible to prevent it. Now, we're still some way off, but that's been the main objective of our research. In many ways, there are lots of problems in the UK. As with all countries in the world, there's never enough money and so on. But I think we can be proud that we've had laws and policies that have generally very clearly promoted independence and opportunity for people with Down syndrome and for all people with learning disabilities. And I think just to say that the same is true in India, that recently you've got a new law, and I think that's very important as a starting point, that there's an acceptance at the highest level of government that people with Down syndrome have the right to independence and opportunity in later life. The next issue is how do you do it? And here there may be some differences between India and the UK. So in the UK, many people with learning disabilities, when they become adults, so 18 or 20, they will move away from the family home. So there are many organisations now that provide expert support to people with Down syndrome and will support them, throughout adult life. In addition to that, what we are trying to do is to make certain that there is expertise in other areas, health areas, that are available to people with Down syndrome if they develop health problems. So, for example, our general practitioners or family doctors are encouraged to learn more about Down syndrome. They're encouraged to undertake health checks regularly of people with Down syndrome. But there are also people like myself, psychiatrists, who specialise in the area. And there are people in other disciplines that may run special clinics for people with Down syndrome. So I think supporting someone with Down syndrome in adult life requires very good social care. And in some cases, families will continue to provide support, but as I said, that's now increasingly organizations, many of them charitable organizations, that provide that support. But you also need health expertise, people like speech and language therapists and so on, to help people overcome some of their difficulties. And if a problem arises, they can turn to those health experts to seek advice. So I see people with Down syndrome, for example, if their behavior deteriorates or if someone thinks they've become depressed, the people supporting them will call upon me for advice. So you really do need this sort of network of support, of social care experts, if you like, people providing the day-to-day care, but you also need experts within health across many disciplines that are available to be called upon if difficulties arise. I think we're at a very exciting time, and I speak primarily here as a researcher. I mean, there's always the challenge more generally of can you improve opportunities for people with Down syndrome? And I have to say I've been enormously impressed about the effort that's going on here in India to do exactly that, to provide opportunities to allow people with Down syndrome to have choice. And I think that needs to continue, absolutely needs to continue. But as a neuroscientist, as a psychiatrist, I think what we now have are the tools, the research techniques to better understand what's going on in the brain, and particularly to understand why they develop dementia, or why a significant proportion of people with Down syndrome develop dementia. And ultimately, hopefully, to develop treatments that could be given, can be started relatively early in life and actually prevent dementia developing. And I think we also better understand, even if we don't have treatments at the moment, we better understand how to support people with Down syndrome who have now developed dementia and sadly are losing skills.